Next, Atlantic staff writer Ed Yong.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. I'm Ed Yong. I've been reporting on the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic for The Atlantic, and I am very pleased to introduce today someone who has been thinking about pandemic preparedness for a very long time. Bill Gates, thank you so much for being here. So, Bill, we last spoke about this topic in 2018, a very different time. You described then that pandemic preparedness was an area that shook your trademark optimism about the trajectory of the world. You said, boy, do we not have our act together. How do you feel about the way the pandemic has played out this year?
Well, sadly, I think the most pessimistic view of how unprepared we were has actually played out, particularly in the United States. And so with something that can grow exponentially, like infectious disease, a little bit of preparedness where you can act early, makes such a difference. And a few countries have distinguished themselves, but most countries have not.
And looking at how the US has fared, what has surprised you, and where do you see that we've gone wrong?
Well, the US had a lot of assets going into this. First of all, we weren't ground zero. China was ground zero. Then it moved over into Europe. And so the U.S. had more time to get ready. The U.S. has more PCR machines than, all the other countries. Per capita, we're very blessed with an expensive medical infrastructure. And we have groups like CDC and BARDA. So the U.S. had done more to get ready than other countries had in advance. Now, there was some destaffing of these things under this administration. But even so, I would have expected us to get the commercial providers up and going, like South Korea or Germany or Australia did. The fact that actually was made harder by FDA regulations, and that somebody actually thought the public health testing capacity, which actually was bungled, would have enough capacity. It was, it's really insane, which speaks to just not getting the leadership to have a framework of what needed to be done. There were so many phone calls about we've got to get diagnostic capacity up and we have to get quick results. I participated in a lot of those calls, and yet to this day, that's just a complete mess.
Can you say more about that leadership piece, Bill? Because I think you're one of the few people who has had direct contact with the president and the administration about the matter of pandemic preparedness. You've tried to, as I understand it, emphasize the importance of this to them. What is your assessment of America's leaders and their response to this pandemic?
Well, you can look at the period before the epidemic hits and say, even though the U.S. didn't do a very good job, most other countries didn't. There were a few that had been hit by SARS or MERS that had a little bit of practice understanding, diagnosis, contact tracing is super important. So they're among the countries that did the best. So, I'd give the U.S. like a C minus, but all countries, many would get an even worse grade of how ready they were before this thing hit. Mm-hmm. Then once it hits, I had a thing called the Seattle Flu Study, which was looking at all respiratory viruses. And because the study protocol didn't include coronavirus, we weren't really authorized, but the principal investigator decided to look and saw the first community spread of coronavirus here in the United States. And that should have, set off such alarms to get the domestic testing, to change the criteria of who got tested. This notion that the travel ban was some beneficial thing, that's just not true, because we didn't test those people. We didn't quarantine those people. And so then, after the pandemic starts, there hasn't been any coherence. Now, the R&D funding, I will say that, the BARDA money, the purchase agreements, that's where the U.S. actually does get the highest grade in the world. Europe hasn't funded nearly as much of that R&D, which is a global public good. Now we need to complement that with funding the factories and the procurement for the global response, which the U.S. has been absent so far, but I'm still hopeful that if there's another supplemental bill, we'll get about $8 billion for international COVID activities into that bill.
Do you think that the pandemic should change the way we think about global health? There's always been this sense of richer developed nations like the US helping out developing ones, but in this crisis, many of the richest countries have fared appallingly, whereas many poorer ones from Senegal to Vietnam have actually done really well. Do you think that this is this should be cause for humility, a change in our approach?
Well, certainly humility is called for because the damage, whether it's economic, educational, mental health, is so large. Other than a world war, this is the worst thing that's happened in over a century. And so we should all say, wow, we didn't understand about masks. We didn't understand about asymptomatics. Even the medical profession, we haven't taken understanding these different respiratory diseases quite as seriously as we should. So everyone has lessons here. And of course, as long as the pandemics, we mostly should focus on, okay, how do we get monoclonals done and available to everyone? How do we get the vaccine done? This looking back, a lot of that can be preserved for when we bring the thing to a close. The idea of which interventions work well, these trials, that's another area that has been such a mess with no leadership at all that we're still confused about plasma. There probably are some drugs that have been missed. It was the only thing we actually have of significance is the UK trial that the foundation helped fund that showed dexamethasone as having a good result. You would have expected the U.S. to get a lot going on to prove out other interventions.
And why do you think that the research on interventions has been so chaotic, is it fair to say?
Well, there's actually a question in the U.S. system of who's in charge of making sure that consistent trials get done. The FDA is just there to say at the end, okay, you did this well. They're not there to instigate trials. NIH is more on the research side. CDC is public health. BARDA is more a procurement thing. So actually, under that HHS umbrella, who is supposed to really orchestrate these trials is actually unclear. If you'd had particularly enlightened leadership of that and seen that as a priority between the various groups, including NIH, you could have done it well. The UK, in fact, although they have many things in this epidemic, even a few they did worse than the US, which is hard. In terms of organizing trials, they were very coherent in having the common criteria of patient recruitment and coming up mostly with negative results. I mean, we thought more approved medicines. We did this library of medicines, the pandemic reframe library. We were disappointed that there's few enough antivirals in there, that remdesivir showed modest benefit and two other antivirals are still being pushed forward, although that's been a bit slow. We need to have a gigantic library of antivirals available, for the next time, and then get trials that give very quick results on which of those have an impact.
Absolutely. So I totally agree that that better research on things like medical interventions is important. I think that one of the things the pandemic has highlighted, though, is the relevance of social interventions too. The pandemic has so much widened inequities both around the world and domestically between rich and poor. It has disproportionately hit Black and Latinx and indigenous communities. How are you thinking about those disparities and what needs to be done to address them for this pandemic and for future ones?
Yeah, it is kind of unbelievable that every dimension of inequity has been exacerbated here. And our goalkeepers report that is done in the framework of these sustainable development goals, and we do that every year around this UN General Assembly. Every other year, that's been this positive story of gradual progress. Less children dying, less malnutrition, longer lifespans. And, so we get to say to the world, hey, pay attention to that steady progress and let's look at the heroes and the exemplars and let's drive that even faster. This report had to deliver the news that if you only look at COVID deaths, you're actually missing the scale of the setback because it's also routine immunization, malaria, getting HIV medicines, and things are so disrupted that even gathering the numbers for that was very, very difficult. But, we dropped our routine immunization levels by over 14% that we've spent the last 25 years pulling that together. So there's going to have to be a stronger equity agenda, hopefully on a global basis, once we get out of this, because the developing countries haven't had the fiscal resources like the United States. They don't have as much of their economy with office workers that can be done over the internet. Even though their younger age populations have meant the actual death rate in these countries has been below the rich countries.
Okay, and in terms of the results from the goalkeepers report, there's some. It does make for very galling reading. I'd love to know, which among the various findings there, what's really sticking out for you as being a significant problem that we need to put a lot of energy into trying to address.
Well, it was interesting how hard it was to gather the data. Mostly when we gather data, we rely on the fact that if we sample countries over time, they're all progressing down the same path. Here, you have very different government policies and the spread of the disease is so different in different countries. So our error bars on the facts we were putting forward were even larger than they normally are. So that, was very concerning. Things like the extreme poverty number where, 37 million people driven into extreme poverty, that's really just gut-wrenching because the idealistic view is that that's something we should get rid of altogether. And yet, I do worry that the pandemic, because it did hit rich countries, their generosity actually might be less. Most of the time when we talk about infectious diseases, our problem is that the world doesn't pay attention to malaria or TB. Here, because people care so much about getting the vaccines, they're actually, saying, okay, we should, maybe be even less generous. And in the case of the vaccine, use the rich countries' ability to pay more and have it all be allocated to them. And so not only does the pandemic last longer in developing countries, the kind of generosity that historically has helped might even go down.
And do you see those kind of inequities also playing out in the US? Again, going back to some of the social inequities we've talked about, I guess one of my concerns is that the groups that have been disproportionately burdened by this pandemic and by this long-standing history of systemic discrimination will be last in line to receive the vaccine when it comes out. What work should and can be done to reduce that inequity back home?
Well, that allocation algorithm, one way to help with that is to have so much volume that you're not making super hard trade-offs. And so, the vaccine expertise in the foundation, we're trying to help with that. And if multiple get approved, actually the volumes could be quite large. We should look at the risk levels and, based on that, you would say that various inner city communities, including Blacks and Hispanics, would have somewhat higher priority. So that algorithm, which, the CDC should be getting people, to sign up, that saying, hey, I want the vaccine, and giving some of this criteria, the same way that we wanted a CDC website for people seeking a test. Here we should have a CDC website for people who are saying they're willing to take the vaccine, where you understand their age and ethnicity and location, and then you can take that and come up with what the equitable priority ranking should be. I'm not seeing that sense of gathering the data to come up with those algorithms. So it's kind of bizarre that you have these over-optimistic projections that the vaccine will come soon. But when you read the 67-page report about how it's distributed, it doesn't actually concretely identify the criteria or how the information is going to be gathered to do this, to do the prioritization. And so, it's just like everything with this, the vacuum of leadership and the unwillingness of people to step forward because it'll say, oh, this thing's a mess. We need to fill in these answers there. I see the India plan for vaccine distribution as more concrete than what's here in the U.S.
It does seem like poor data collection is a problem that has plagued the US throughout this entire pandemic. There have been long-standing questions about the quality of the information that we're getting about what is happening within this country. Do you see that as a problem? Do you think is the nature of the data gap surprising to you?
Well, the progress on overall health statistics, this thing called the Global Burden of Disease, which is hosted at IHME at the University of Washington, that we've been involved in helping Chris Murray and his team build that up. The health statistics in the U.S. are better today than they've ever been. In fact, it's fascinating to go and browse and look at gender differences and changes over time or difference between different states. In the dynamic of the epidemic, we've fallen behind a little bit, and we don't have quite as many standards of how things are reported. And a little bit, CDC got interfered with for their normal function. But the U.S., can be an exemplar on this. The push towards digitization and has, thank goodness, because of it helps you connect up to telemedicine. It's gotten a big boost from the epidemic, that paper records are much harder to move around, and so slowly but surely the U.S. on the overall data and even the digital health records, I do think will be an exemplar there.
You mentioned the IHME, and I wanted to ask you about this because the model that they created has been criticized by other epidemiologists and statisticians who, certainly in the early phases of the pandemic, underestimating the toll that it would take over time. And I know the model was heavily influential in the administration's thinking about this. Do you have any thoughts about that contribution, especially given your foundation's support of that group?
Well, I think modeling has certain limitations. The people behind the 538 website did some really good, even a kind of a cartoon thing to show how just picking a few parameters that are unknown can cause wildly varying results. The imperial model actually gave very big numbers, but of course it assumed that people didn't change their behavior at all. They kept going to work and everything. And so, that was kind of an upper bound to get politicians' attention. I think that was very valuable, even though, of course, people did sometimes voluntarily, sometimes under government mandate, change their behavior. All these models are not perfect because there's so many unknown parameters. I have a modeling group inside the foundation called the Institute for Disease Modeling. And of course, we fund IHME. I do think those models have been helpful. If you look at their accuracy in a 2 to 4 week time frame, it's been pretty good. Now, 2-3 months out, which is what you really want to know, is a lot harder. And so, for example, right now, we have a divergence between the models that do think this is a seasonal disease and that people will be more lax in their behavior. So IHME, they forecast a very tough fall in the United States. Now, I have to say, they forecast the resurgence in Europe, which the other people who were more optimistic about the fall did not forecast that resurgence, which probably is its laxity and seasonality causing that rebound. And so, even though we're not totally certain, it looks like we're headed for a very tough fall. IHME as a forecaster is a little bit different than them, gathering the data for the history, which is their main thing. But the U.S. government didn't even have a plan on which modelers to work with and how to work with them. So I've taken, the governor of New York called me up and said, hey, how many ventilators do I need? And, thank goodness the IHME model gave him a much more realistic view than some of the other oversimplistic models that he was dealing with.
So you and your foundation have shaped a lot of the research, the funding space, the sort of thinking around global health. Looking at what has happened with the pandemic this year, with the benefit of hindsight, do you see any mistakes? Do you think, would you do anything differently in the future? How are you thinking about how to learn lessons from what has happened with COVID-19?
Well, I'm hopeful that the things that I and other people put forward even before 2015, but in a very clear way, there was a post-Ebola, post-West Africa Ebola discussion, where we talked about doing the equivalent of war games, having the diagnostics people able to scale up, having antiviral libraries, getting generic vaccine platforms, like hopefully what the RNA platform will become, where 5 to 10 years from now, it will have low cost and high scalability, which it sadly right at the moment, it's not as strong as some of the other platforms in that respect. So I think the prescription, is still the same as it was before this pandemic hit. And, the cost of doing it, is in the tens of billions, not hundreds of billions. So compared to, say, defense budgets, this is not a gigantic additional burden. And in fact, if it's done appropriately, it will drive progress in things that will help us with diseases that are here today. Amazingly, BioNTech, who's Pfizer's partner, they're doing vaccines for cancer, and that's their primary business model. But, our foundation partners with them, because some of that work of making vaccines can help for the equity agenda around infectious diseases. So I think, we can be ready for the next time, so that if something that's not much worse than this hits, the impact would be, 5% of what it's been here. And I do think we can use that for making progress on other diseases, and that the fiscal trade-off involved is actually pretty modest.
And I've got to ask: do you think that we will learn that lesson? The last time we talked about this, it was about whether these discussions, which have already been had, these warnings that were already sounded, will actually translate into action. They didn't. In large part, do you think that this crisis will actually spur introspection?
Yes. The lack of working on this was that people, didn't think about it. Infectious diseases, mostly we've made so much progress that rich countries kind of ignore them. And here, because it's hit and cost trillions of dollars. I mean, what I'm talking about as the preparedness, as a percentage of the damage this thing done is, it's not even close to 1%. And it has affected everyone in every rich country. I mean, there's basically no country that hasn't had very big damage. So yes, we are not so blithe that this time This is not just Ebola, which hit 3 countries in Western Africa. This is a tragedy. If you care about education, if you care about race, if you care about mental health, if you care about gender, if you care about government budgets, having money to do things that you want government to do, this is cost so much. I put $3 trillion in my TED Talk in 2015. By the time this is done, we'll be at over $20 trillion of total economic cost. So, I was, way understating it there, even though when I said the term $3 trillion, I was like, wow, that is absolutely so gigantic. So yes, it takes rich people getting sick. It takes rich economies being affected. But when that happens, the world gets together. And thank goodness the state of science is such that building a PCR diagnostics that can be done at a mega testing level where you test, 20% of the country every week. That technology can be done. Some of it will actually come out of GMO seed sequencing, which is extremely high volume. The vaccine platform can be done. The antivirals can be done. The monoclonals can be done. The tracking to see things earlier, that can be done. So we're very lucky. If this had hit 20 years ago, the state of biology, digital infrastructure, you would have had to, just pray that it didn't come back. Now, we do have all the things that we need so that a pathogen like this wouldn't be a big deal in the future.
Well, I hope you're right, Bill. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today. I really appreciate it.
Great to talk to you.